I'm at T Point. The cicadas are out today. I'm about 15 minutes drive outside of Matakana. And you've got this beautiful place. So Jacob Nagle, it's very rare, if at all, that an account from an average sailor, the ordinary sailor, of the era in which he lived and worked, remains. What we tend to get are accounts of captains who served at sea, generals on land, lords, that crust that was very dissimilar to the loaf. So to find and to have a journal account of a sailor of the era, of say the Napoleonic era and the Age of Nelson, is wonderful. A real blessing. Hello there. Caught anything? I take it that's a no. I only wish I had actually knew about it when I was writing my books of that era. He was not shy and giving us a picture into that time and place that some now will find uncomfortable. I'm getting to the point where he is getting older. It's midway in the journal, and there's a stage where he no longer has to worry about being pressed by a press gang. And he meets up with people he knew and makes a whorehouse. Becomes a brothel keeper. He was also a prize agent, getting the prize money for ships. He jumped ship, deserted, and those kind of things. It's a different time, different place. And he gives a real wonderful insight into it. But I think the main thing I want to talk about, I noticed this reading books, specifically modern books of history. It might just be me, I'm aware of that. I think there's a tendency to think that the people of the past, one, knew nothing, and two, weren't like us. And I heartily disagree with that. The older I get, the more I get like a old Tandy home computer. I can only do 3 things at a time. Concentrating, talking and filming might be beyond me. So I was born in 1964. My mother had me quite young. She was born in 1945. Her mother, my grandmother, was born in the 1910s. I knew her as an old lady in her 80s. Her mother was born in the 1880s, and her grandmother was born in the 1850s. That's only 9 or so years after the death of Jacob Nagle. My grandmother was no different to any other person. She had hopes, she had dreams, fears. She could be happy, she could be miserable. It's like us. It's human condition. Her grandmother would have been exactly the same. So when we look to the past, say the 1840s, or in terms of Jacob Nagle, the 1790s, the time of Jane Austen, they are no different than we. They are us back then. The only difference is that, yeah, fashions change, street furniture changes, technology, but that's about it. When you read history books, specifically written in the modern era, it's almost though the writer, the author, wants to suck out all human emotion. We'll read about great tank battles in Russia and Kursk, and we'll read about D-Day, and we'll read about the invasion of Sicily, and you'll struggle to find what people thought. When you come across something like Jacob Nagle, it's so wonderfully refreshing to be reminded of what it is to be human, because he talks about his hopes and his fears, and his anger, his disappointments with himself and others. So it's a great book, a wonderful book, for that one reason. So many themes, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Not so much what he did, but mainly what it tells about us. The way history used to be taught was to have somebody write a piece comparing one person with another, a tyrant opposed to a good leader, so that you could be informed as to what it really means to be a good leader. If it weren't for these steps, couldn't get along this path. I deliberately didn't film the last 20 minutes walk, but I now see the light at the end of the tunnel. You come out of the darkness into the light, feel like a hobbit coming out of the green hill country. So the path goes along this beautiful little coastline here. That's Omaha Beach. Not named after the World War II battle. It's an old Maori name. So the ancients compared, instructed, said, this is how we should be, not like this person. There's definitely an ethical, moral side to history. When you read Nagle, you get the feeling similar, but also the positive and negative attributes of one person. He showed endeavour, tenacity, entrepreneurial spirit, we call it now, philanthropy back then, even though he did businesses we may not necessarily agree on. He also shows a very strong sense of morals, not rigid, more relativist. And studying his works, you gain more insight into that than you do ever reading any philosophy books, because you know he was real. He lived it. It's like there's some bananas here. They're more plantains than bananas. Huge. Good size, this one. I'm so blessed that I found the book. A keeper, for sure. Now this path, I could go up there quite a distance. It comes to an end at like a shelf of rocks. You can't go much further. About another 10-15 minute walk. But here, you see straight out to the Pacific. So Jacob Nagle, brilliant, brilliant book. By a man who's, well, he never thought he was going to be read. It was his journal. He had a real adventure with the sea. So now I think it's time to update you as to what he got up to. And this is the book, the journal itself. Although it's more than that, because there are pieces here, not just of the journal, but imagery. There's a glossary, and there's the foreword by the editor, John C. Dan. Just a brilliant book, beautifully put together. A lot of colour templates. So, The thumbnail shows a typical man of the era, and it's not just about Nagle's journal, it's what the journal says about us. And I think that's the key. I'm going to talk about the events of what Nagle got through, so I'm just going to put this to one side. In 1796 he ended up in the Mediterranean on HMS Gorgon, and Nelson was in charge of that squadron. He became in charge of the 5th gun, so the broadside of cannon. He was the captain of one. And there's this wonderful moment where he talks about the fact he was nearly killed. Shows you the kind of things that they had to put up with. So I'm going to go to the requisite page. So they're standing in towards Italy. The 7th of September 1796. The shot from the tower being hot shot, therefore one watch was employed with fire buckets and the other half at their quarters. So this was hard work, heady work. I was stationed as captain of the 5 gun from forward abreast the chess tree. Let's not go into the particular details, but it's like a run of stumps of wood where they would often put shot. A hot shot entered the chess tree and passed the back of my neck. Having tied hair, it cut and singed my hair without doing any more damage to me. The officer of the deck, coming along at that moment, ordered me to lay down, and by stooping my head, the shot entered which would have beheaded me completely. The same shot wounded an officer with the splinters, and splinters were appalling at that time. They were big as a man's head. 5 or 6 yards off, and I, being abreast of it, received no damage. It killed some fowls in the hen coops amidships and entered the spare topmasts on the booms and broke the iron wenches, that is the winches, pumped ship with into pieces. Dangerous work. But then you could say the same of any war. You could say it now, out in various places where people are being shot at. He was also, and this I find fascinating, out in the Mediterranean, the history of it was that they had Leghorn or Livorno in Italy, which was very pro-Britain. Napoleon took over that part of Italy, and therefore suddenly it was shut off, and they were getting supplies from there. They had to smuggle off produce, and it says here, we were sent over to Leghorn for cattle which we could get by smuggling off in the night along shore. Interestingly, it's still smuggling. You're going against the authorities. You're trying to get either produce in or out. But of course this is war, and no one was considering smuggling then. You were doing it on behalf of His Majesty. It's interesting, isn't it? Who becomes a pirate and who becomes a privateer? It's who says. It depends on who it benefits. He was on a cruise off Toulon, and he spells it Talon. And Toulon was the major French port at the bottom of the French Mediterranean. And they had a captain called Hotham, who I write about in my books. But he was a bit of a martinet, not very well liked. He was too much of a tyrant with his men. And he got so bad that the men refused to work for him. So Nelson, who was in charge of that squadron, as I said, in the space of half an hour, the Commodore came on board, called all hands aft, and enquired the reason of this disturbance. He was informed of Captain Hotham's character, which was the reason that we refused him. Lads, said he, this is Nelson, you have the greatest character on board the Blanche of any frigate's crew in the Navy. You have taken 2 frigates superior to the frigate you are in, and now to rebel. If Captain Hotham ill-treats you, give me a letter, and I will support you. There was cheers. Nelson went off. Fate had happened because Nagle was the only man to have met Washington and Nelson, and then he writes about it. Incredible. As time goes on, he joins a ship called the Nagle, which is not very big, and it's stationed off Portugal. And he writes very clearly that he became the prize master. So there was this part of the Articles of War that they should attack and board and take any enemy ship. And if they did, they would get shares. And depending on your position on the ship, it got lower and lower and lower. But he was the prize master who had to take a reckoning of the worth of a ship that was taken, how much each man on board was to get, and keep record of it. And that was quite an important job, and it was given to him as he was getting into his 30s, early 40s. And we're getting close to the point in the story where he no longer has to worry if he did desert another ship, and he's done it quite a few times. He didn't have to care about the press. He was getting too old. So it's at that point where things begin to change in this story. He became a quartermaster on the same ship, and this ship off Portugal was used to spy. Very interesting aspect in terms of warfare. Nagle served on the Nagle from the 28th of July 1798 until the 26th of June 1801. Appointed quartermaster off the Portuguese coast when the ship was making captures almost daily. He thrived, and he said it was the most rewarding period of his life. It was primarily a vehicle used for confidential spy networking between London and Paris. Nagle mentions that the ship frequently put royalists ashore. And then there's a very famous man, if you love this period and you love naval history, Sir Sidney Smith. And Patrick O'Brien bases a lot of events that Jack Aubrey gets into on this gentleman. The Nagle was obviously of particular interest at the highest level of the English or Pitt's administration. The captain sent most of operational reports directly to an Evan Nepean, Secretary of the Admiralty, who in turn made certain that most of the detailed letters describing the Nagle's success was published in the London Gazette or the Naval Chronicle. So what happened was a ship became famous for its work. The Navy and the Naval Chronicle, which was a newspaper to highlight and really promote the Navy and all the things that were happening to it. This was a great story. It was a story that the readers loved to read about, that a little ship, hardly bigger than a frigate, was doing great things, daring do, making success of the captain. And in an era where the captains wanted to get glory and renowned, obviously for advancement and money, the fact that it was very popular and very much part of the Royal Navy. It went from an almost semi-piratical fleet into one of daring do and adventure because of all this kind of thing. The pursuit of glory. And the aspect of Sidney Smith and spying, it's so Patrick O'Brien. In 1802, he was 41 years old. He had a wife of 7 years living with her parents in Portsmouth, with whom he had spent less than 6 months since they were married, and he had children. And the Nagle Journal depicts him almost as a stoic who is putting up with all this toing and froing and war and events. It's just amazing. His intention was to take his wife and children back to the United States, which he hadn't seen for 21 years at this stage. He brought his family up to Deptford, which is near London, where they briefly took a room and waited for a ship to Lisbon. And what unfolds now is tragedy, and it's on a scale that we cannot comprehend how often this happened at this era. In Lisbon, where they hoped to start a new life, things went badly from the beginning. He was cheated out of his prize money, he was victimised by a landlord, he had to swallow up lawyer's fee, he had to find a court. Lisbon experienced a terrible yellow fever epidemic in 1802, and it took away his wife and children. He lost his whole family. An embargo was placed on shipping to the United States. He could get passage to Norfolk, Virginia, and when he got there, he learned that both his parents were dead. He visited his relatives in Pennsylvania and Maryland before returning to Philadelphia and taking up the occupation of a merchant seaman. He was of a different era. So if I do a third episode about this, which I think I will, it really depicts how this man was a product of the previous age. So as we're moving down onwards to, say, 1800 and 203, to the end of the War of 1815 and beyond, the 19th century sensibilities, the morality starts to kick in. They're trying to get the Navy of old, with all its debauchery and the way ships would come to harbour in Britain and anchor up, and prostitutes would come on board. It was like a great whorehouse on the sea. That was starting to cause concern with a generation that was coming up very much in the likes of Jane Austen. And it was no longer tolerated, especially as Britain was then winning. So things began to change. The Navy was not the Navy that Nagle had become part of in the very beginning. He felt like a fish out of water. He never got into the mainstream of the 19th century. He was a dinosaur by this era. And the latter part is about the transition from that era into another, which I may talk about, and use that as a hook to complete the journal. It's all about what it teaches us about ourselves, because it's us back then if we had lived. And I've written down here a couple of things. One, the brutality of war, and that's a thing of all ages, and how it affects us. And in fact, I'm just reading this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And in it, I mean, he survived Auschwitz, and he says this amazing thing here. The central theme of existentialism is to live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering. If there is a purpose in life at all, there must be a purpose in suffering and dying. And Frankl is fond of quoting Nietzsche. He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. And that's Nagle to a T. He lived in this world, this era, where it was brutal. I mean, to survive at sea with all those storms and lack of food, and in battle, most people died of disease, and ships were lost at a frequency that beggars belief, and often we don't know why. It's probably lost in a storm. We don't know half the people that ever served on the ships because their logbooks have not come down to us. But it was a brutal era, and he lived through it. And again, just as Man's Search for Meaning, the likes of Nagle, they found something to keep them going. And we can learn a lot from that. We could also learn about people standing up against tyranny and effectively saying to those in authority as a collective, no, you're not going to treat us like this anymore, and we will stand up against you. And that caused those in power to shirk, stand back and think, oh, okay, we need to give them something, and they did. That's something we can learn about today, isn't it? Tenacity of humans in those situations, the fact that certain people do certain employment that we may think are of no worth, but for the person doing them, it's a job of worth. It often keeps them alive, keeps them in food. And Nagle didn't want to be at sea half the time. He would rather get off certain ships and go elsewhere. He had to put up with it and wait his time. And the fact that the tragedy was all common. Disease wasn't really known, what caused things to happen, infections. I got a chest infection, like I said. It's here, it rattles at night when I'm trying to lay down, but when I'm stood up, it's fine. So it's like reading a how to survive under harsh conditions. It's great for that. And I'm so grateful that I personally have found it, and I'm reading it because it's just a wonder. It's not Nagle in the past. It's as though what he did is a lesson for us now, as a people, as a collective, as individuals. And as James A. Michener says on the back, Nagle was a remarkable fellow, and it's remarkable that he was such a reliable, interesting writer. His book is a revelation. Ta-ta for now.